This is the fifth and final video in my Colorado woodblock print series. In this video, I'm excited to share with you the printing process as well as the finished product, of course. To start out, I want to talk a little bit about the paper preparation. So for this project, I decided to use Bamboo Select from Awagami. This is the first time I've tried it, and it's a pretty thick paper. So when I received the paper, it was in these really large sheets, and my first step was to just cut them down to the rough size of my woodblock print. I made sure to cut them a little bit larger than I needed, just to make sure that I had enough space around the margins in the final product. Once the sheets were cut to size, I added a little number to each sheet of paper, and I put it on the back corner of the sheet. This number is used to identify the prints throughout the printing process, and it also helps me to remember which corner to fit into the kento. I also added my usual nail polish to each of those numbers, or the corner should I say, which helps to give a little bit of strength to the paper. Sometimes when you put the paper in the kento, it can wear out the corner and just kind of make the paper a little less crisp. The final step of paper preparation is to moisten those sheets of paper. To start, I lay down a couple pieces of junk paper and add some moisture. This will serve as kind of the bed for the printing sheets. Once the bed is laid, I add those printing sheets and apply moisture in between every single one. This time I made sure to add a little bit extra moisture because the paper is really thick, and so it needed a little bit more to distribute through the paper. After the printing sheets, I add another layer of junk paper and then ziplock it into a bag. I also add weight on top and let it sit overnight. This helps to evenly distribute that moisture throughout the stack, and when I wake up the next morning, it will be nice and ready to print. I now want to walk you through each of the printing impressions and talk a little bit about how they add up to the finished print. I'll also discuss a little bit about the challenges or advantages of certain printing techniques during the process. The first impression was this large green flat area. It serves as kind of the backdrop for the print and acts as the green foliage in the composition. This was a really large area, so it definitely took a lot of pressure on the impressions. I struggled a little bit at first to get even color throughout, but as time went on, I felt pretty good about this impression. Since it's a pretty simple block, I could pretty much apply as much pressure as I wanted to for the most part, because there was no risk of muddling the details, and so it was mostly just elbow grease on this one. Next up was the blue sky impression. I started this print with the intention that it would be a bokashi, a gradient coming from the top. However, as I went on, I decided to make it a flat color area. So it's a very light blue, flat impression. And as you can see, there's a few regions of color. This print was pretty straightforward. I just had to make sure to mix the pigment and nori well on the block and make sure to hit all the regions evenly. Then I applied pressure, and since it's a much smaller area than the green impression, I didn't have to use quite as much pressure. The third impression is a flat color to fill in the aspen tree trunks. The color was pretty much just a very light gray with a little bit of yellows in there to give it a different tone. And it was a pretty straightforward impression. It's really, again, just 3 flat color areas that are very simple in shape. So I just had to make sure everything was mixed well in the block and apply a good bit of pressure. Next, I used the same block again to apply a little bit of a gradient to the aspen trees. I did this to give the trees a little bit of depth and show the 3D nature of them. To do this, I added a little bit of light gray pigment on one side of my brush and brushed back and forth on each aspen tree to pull that pigment across horizontally. I was really happy with this impression, and I think it really made a big difference in the finished print. Impression 5 and 6 were carved on the same block, so I ended up doing these at the same time for convenience. The first one was the purple of the petals on the columbine flowers. For this impression, it's another straightforward and flat impression, but I decided to print it twice just to make sure that the color was deep enough. This yellow area is another flat color impression, but I applied a very light amount of pressure due to the small surface area of the block. I also used a really light pigment because I just wanted a touch of yellow color on those flowers. This impression is my favorite impression of the whole print. It's a circular gradient to help fill in the color of the flowers. I guess I might call it a radial gradient. It's not something that I've actually tried before. To do it, I added pigment onto one side of my brush, as usual, and I actually spun the brush around that edge. That way the color stayed in the center of that printing area and then was slowly pulled outwards as I spun the brush. Of course, it was a little bit tricky to do this, so it wasn't an exact science, and so it led to a kind of muddled area on the smaller flower. So what I decided to do was to do the larger 2 flowers twice and the smaller flower once, because it was a little bit harder to get the definition I wanted. I think this impression came out really well, and I was super excited once I got to this stage in the printing. The 8th impression was back to a flat color. This one is the dark green color that fills in all of the little plants and vines and grasses that are represented in my key block. For this one, it was pretty simple. I just made sure to add a good amount of pigment in nori because of the large surface area and just apply even pressure throughout the whole impression. It came out pretty nicely because there were no large individual areas, rather a lot of, smaller areas on the color block that were spread out. So it was much easier to get this impression to come out very clean. The last impression was the key lines, which is pretty typical for my process. The only main difference between the key lines and the other color blocks is that the key lines require a little bit less nori. I also tend to use a bit less water because sometimes I see that the key lines can kind of bleed a little bit if there's too much water present. Overall, these impressions went really smoothly. Once I'm done with the printing and I've started to put my materials away, the next step is to get into the drying process. The first thing I did with these Colorado prints was to lay them out just openly on the ground. This is kind of my pre-drying step. It helps to get some of the moisture out before they're pressed. It'll speed up the drying process a little bit overall. Once the prints had dried out in the open for a little bit, I then added them to my typical drying board stack. This step helps to ensure that the prints dry completely flat, and I even add a really heavy weight on top of the stack, which helps to ensure that they stay 100% flat during the drying process. After a few days of waiting, I finally uncovered those prints and could take the final steps to finish them off. So the first one was to trim the edges to the precise size of the finished print. As you may remember, I ended up cutting the sheets a little bit larger than they needed to be to start. Now I want to make sure that the border is even on all sides. So I pulled out my ruler and my blade once again to get those down to the proper size. Once that's all done, I can finally proceed to the last step of the process. Now I just need to sign a number with my pencil at the bottom of the print. Something about this process is super rewarding because it almost feels like it's the first time I've seen the finished print. Adding that text at the bottom really kind of pulls everything together for me, and it's really exciting to see what it looks like. I really hope that you guys have enjoyed this printmaking journey with me. It's been a really long process, but I'm super proud of the finished product and I really enjoyed the process along the way. It took longer than it should have, but I'm super happy to present this to you now and I really hope you enjoyed it. Please leave this video a like and a comment if you enjoyed it. It really helps out my channel and I can't wait to see you guys in the next video. Cheers.